For Unit 2, Day 6, we're going to talk about some polynomial inequalities. We've talked a little bit about open circles and closed circles when we've talked about graphing. We've also talked about interval notation. So let me start by giving you just a little bit of a review of those two things. So we're going to be working on a number line here. So I'm going to talk about greater than or less than, sorry, that's less than or greater than. When we're talking about those, we're going to be drawing an open circle on our number line. Looks like this. And we're going to be using parentheses when we talk about those in my interval notation. All right, then if we talk about less than or equal to or greater than or equal to, we're going to be using closed circles on our number line. They look kind of like a filled in dot, like that. And I'm going to be using brackets on my interval notation. And then let me just remind you that negative infinity and positive infinity always use parentheses. We never use brackets when we're talking about positive and negative infinities. Okay, so you can have a bracket on one side and parentheses on the other. All of those kinds of things are fine. All right, so let's get just a little practice first. By graphing some things on a number line. I'm going to use that little symbol for number line, and write in interval notation. Okay, so let me start with negative 2 is less than x, which is less than or equal to 5. Okay, so always nice to write on a number line first, and we're going to be using number lines with our polynomials here in a minute as sign charts, but always nice to write on those first because it just kind of gets your numbers in the right order. It gives you the positives and the negatives. It shows you where we're shading, all different kinds of things. So let's say that I've got kind of 0 on my number line, so this would be negative 2, and this would be 5. And I'm going to put an open circle on negative 2 since we're just using in this case, it's actually greater than. I know it's going in the direction of less than, but we're talking about in terms of x. So x's are greater than negative 2, and x's are less than or equal to 5. So less than or equal to gets a solid circle. It looks just like a little dot right there. And so with x's being greater than negative 2 and less than or equal to 5, that means I'm going to shade in between. And so my shading on my number line would look like that. Okay, and so for interval notation, I'm going to use parentheses on my negative 2 since it doesn't have the equal to, and I'm going to use brackets on my 5. Okay, let me do one more of these. Let's take a look at all of the x's that are less than or equal to 1. Okay, so back on my number line, I'm going to go and I'm going to put a 1 on here. So 1, let me make that kind of a fancy 1. And less than or equal to, so I'm going to use a solid circle, and then I'm going to shade all of the x's that are less than 1, so 0 and negative 1 and negative 2 going forever that direction. Okay, so I'm going to call this down. So down here, that's going to be negative infinity, always parentheses on negative infinity, so even though we're using a less than or equal to, always parentheses on negative infinity, all the way up to 1, and I'm going to use a bracket on that 1 to show that it is equal to. Okay, so let me turn into, take a look for a minute at some nonlinear polynomials with their inequalities, and we're going to talk about some sign charts. And you'll use sign charts a lot with these number lines when you get into calculus. It's going to really help you with solving some things. Okay, so again, I kind of want to solve, I want to write on my number line, and then I want to put into interval notation. So let's get a little bit harder here. All right, so I'm going to say, let's take a look at x squared minus 4x minus 5, and I want to know where that is less than or equal to 0. Okay, so let's think about less than 0 as being negative. So numbers that are less than 0 are negative, and numbers that are greater than 0 are positive. So it's nice if you can get 0 over here on this side if it's not already, so that we can talk about some positive and negative values. So try to get 0 over here on this side first. In this case, it already is. Okay, so the first thing I want to do, this is talking about things less than or equal to 0. So the first thing I want to do is I want to find out where is this thing equal to 0. So I'm going to take my x squared, oops, let's hang on to that for a second. I'm going to take my x squared minus 4x minus 5, and I want to find out where it's equal to 0, so I'm going to start with some factoring if I can. If you can't factor, remember you can always use the quadratic formula. All right, so x squared factors into x and x, and my only factors of 5 are 5 and 1, and I want this 4 to be negative, so I'm going to say minus 5 and plus 1. Okay, so it would give me x squared. This would give me 1, and negative 5x would give me negative 4x, and then this over here would give me negative 5. Okay, so I'm going to take those out. I'm going to set them equal to 0. And so I'm going to find out that x is equal to 0 at x equals 5, and where x is equal to negative 1. So there's going to be my zeros. All right, so let me go over here and draw those on a number line real quick. All right, so here's negative 1. And up here is 5. And again, the nice part about a number line is it makes you put those things in order. Okay, I'm talking about less than or equal to, so I'm going to use some solid circles on both of those. So if I was just looking at less than, I would use an open circle on both of those. So closed circles on those. Okay, so here's where my sign chart kind of comes into play. I'm going to draw kind of a border here and a border here. Okay, and all I really care about right now is whether these things are positive or negative. Okay, all I care about is if it's positive or negative in the 3 regions that I just formed. So here's a region, and then I've got one in between, and then I've got one up here above 5. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug into my factored form right here, and I'm using my factored form because it's going to be easier to plug into, especially when we start talking about some bigger equations like x to the 4th. Okay, so I'm just going to pick a number anywhere that is less than negative 1 right here. So I could pick like negative 2, I could pick negative 3, I could pick negative 4, anything that's less than negative 1. And I'm going to plug in right here. So I'm going to say negative 2 minus 5 gives me negative 7. That is a negative. Again, I only care about positives and negatives. Then I'm going to multiply that by negative 2 plus 1, which is negative 1. That is also negative. And I know that a negative times a negative would give me a positive. So any number that I picked in this area here to plug into this would give me a positive value. Okay, you could try negative 3 if you wanted. Negative 3 would give me negative 8 times negative 2. A negative times a negative would give me a positive. So they're giving me different values, but again, all I care about right now is positives and negatives. Okay, let's pick an easy number. Anytime you can choose 0, go ahead and do that, because 0 is always going to be the easiest. Okay, so 0 minus 5 gives me negative 5. That's a negative. And 0 plus 1 gives me 1. That's a positive. And I know a negative times a positive gives me a negative. And then finally, I'm going to pick a number above 5. So let's say 6. You could use 7 or 8. It doesn't matter as long as it's greater than 5. And 6 minus 5 gives me 1. That's positive. And 6 plus 1 gives me 7. That's a positive. And I know a positive times a positive gives me a positive. Okay, and a lot of the times they will alternate like that. A lot of the times it'll be positive, negative, or negative, positive, negative, but not always. So be careful with saying that's always the rule. Most of the time it is, but there are some situations where it's not. If you have a multiplicity of 2 on either one of these zeros, for example, you may end up with something that's positive, positive, negative. So be very careful with that. Okay, so let's look at what we're looking for here. I'm looking for my x values, or my numbers, to be less than 0. So I know numbers that are less than 0 are negative. So I want to shade in the area where I just said it was going to give me negative values, and there it is right there. Okay, these two areas were positive, this one and this one. This area in between was negative. Okay, so my answer then, I'm going to put brackets because I've got closed circles on negative 1 and 5, and brackets to close that off. Okay, let me let you try one. All right, so I'm going to give you x squared minus 5x is greater than 6. Now remember, it's going to be easier to work with if you move the 6 over to the other side first. Okay, so pause your video for just a minute and give that one a try on your own. See if you can do that one. Okay, so I'm going to start by moving my x squared over to this side. Okay, so I subtracted over my 6. And now I'm going to go ahead and factor this. So I'm going to factor x squared, because I still want to know where it's equal to 0. So even though I'm just talking about greater than, I still want to know where my zeros are. So I still want to know where this thing's equal to 0. Okay, so I'm going to factor x squared into x and x. And be careful, this time I want to subtract to give me 5. So my factors of 6, 3, and 2 would add to give me 5, but on this one I want to subtract. So I'm going to use 6 and 1, and I'm going to have a minus 6 and a plus 1. Okay, so x minus 6 is equal to 0, and x plus 1 is equal to 0. So I have zeros at 6 and negative 1. Okay, let's go and put those on my number line. So I've got negative 1 and I've got positive 6. It doesn't really matter spacing wise on your number line. It doesn't matter where they go. Just be sure they're in order. Just be sure your negatives are in negative area and positives in positive area. Okay, on this one I'm just working with greater than, so I'm going to put open circles on those. And I'm going to make some little lines here just to give me my areas for my sign chart. Okay, here's my factored form right here. I'm going to kind of note that out because that's what I'm going to be using to plug into. Okay, so let me start with a number that's less than negative 1. I'm going to use negative 2. But if you want to use negative 3 or negative 4, that's fine as well. Anything will work. All right, so I'm going to go negative 2. So negative 2 minus 6 gives me negative 8. That's a negative. Times negative 2 plus 1 gives me negative 1. That's a negative. So a negative times a negative gives me a positive. Okay, between negative 1 and 6, I could pick any. I could pick 1, 2, 3, 4. But again, if you can use 0, go ahead and use 0. 0 is always a nice number to use. Okay, so 0 in right here would give me negative 6. That's a negative. And 0 in right here would give me 0 plus 1. So that gives me 1. That's a positive. And a negative times a positive gives me a negative. Okay, it's looking a little bit like this sign chart up here, but again, that doesn't always happen, so go ahead and check and make sure. All right, let's plug in 7. That's bigger than 6. Again, you could use 8, 9, it doesn't matter. So I'm going to use 7. 7 minus 6 gives me 1. That's positive. And 7 plus 1 gives me 8. That's a positive. And a positive times a positive is a positive. Okay, now this time I'm looking for numbers that are greater than 0. Okay, so let me jump back up here just for a minute. So numbers that are greater than 0 are going to be positive. So this time I'm looking for answers that are positive. Okay, so I have positives here. And I have positives here. Okay, so this is negative infinity. This is positive infinity. So my answer is going to go, parentheses, always on infinity. From negative infinity to negative 1, parentheses because I have the open circle. We use our little U shape. It's called a union. It holds them together. And then parentheses on 6 because of that open circle. And always parentheses on infinity. And there's my answer to that one. Okay. Let's go and try one more of these. Let me turn over so that I have a little bit more room. I want you to see one where they don't alternate. So all the ones we've worked so far have alternated, like positive, negative, positive. Let me show you one that doesn't. What number is this? Is this number 5? Yeah. Okay, number 5. Let's take a look at negative 4x cubed plus 8x squared is greater than or equal to 0. 0 came out kind of funny looking. Or actually, let's do less than. Let's change that. Sorry. Let's change that to less than or equal to 0. We just did a greater than. Okay, so to factor this one, I'm going to start with my common factors here. So I've got a common factor of 4 in both of those. I've also got a common factor of x squared. I'm going to go ahead and take out the negative as well just to get it off of there. So I'm going to say I've got negative 4x squared. as a common factor, and that's going to leave me with, I took out the negative, I took out the 4. If I take out x squared, that's just going to leave me with x, and then minus, and then I'm going to take out a 4 out of 8 gives me 2, and an x squared out, so that's just going to leave me with x minus 2. And that's really all the factoring that I have to do on that one. Okay, so I'm going to take each of these and set them equal to 0 so that I can find out where my zeros are. Okay, so this is where I'm talking about I've got this multiplicity of 2 right here, and that's going to change what my sign chart looks like a little bit. Okay, so to solve this one, I would divide over by my negative 4, so 0 divided by negative 4 is still 0, and then take the square root. So I get that x is equal to 0, and over here that x is equal to 2. So that's going to be the two things that I put on my number line. By the way, it's nice when you have a number in between the two numbers, or 3 numbers, or however many on your number line. Otherwise, you have to start choosing fractions to plug in, which are just kind of messy. Okay, I'm working with less than or equal to. That's going to be a solid circle here and a solid circle here. And I'm going to mark off my little regions here so that I have something to work with. Okay, let's pick a number that's less than 0. I'm going to choose -1, and I'm going to plug into my factored form right here. Now be careful when you plug into this. This squared is going to make everything positive, but then I'm going to multiply by a -4. So I'm going to call this one factor that I'm plugging into, and then this the other factor that I'm plugging into. Okay, so with -1, -1 squared gives me 1, times -4 gives me a negative, and then -1 minus 2, and here gives me a negative, so a negative times a negative gives me a positive. Okay, something between 0 and 2, let's use 1. Again, they've barely given me enough space to choose an integer in there, but I can. Okay, so there's 1, so 1 squared gives me 1, times -4 gives me a negative. That's going to always give me that negative. And then 1 minus 2 also gives me a negative, and this one is also positive. So that's where I ended up with these. They don't alternate this time. Okay, and then finally up here a number bigger than 2, so I'm going to use 3. You could use 4 or 5, it doesn't matter. So 3 squared gives me 9, times -4 gives me a negative. And 3 minus 2 gives me a positive, so this area is negative. Okay, here's my highlighter. So I'm looking for these numbers to be less than 0. Negative numbers are less than 0, so I'm going to say my answer is here. And so in interval notation, that's going to be a bracket on 2 because of that closed circle. And I'm going to go up to infinity, always parentheses on infinity. Okay, so try the ones on the worksheet and check your selected answers.